What if the greatest city humanity ever built was never meant to touch the ground? Imagine standing at the edge of the Amazon rainforest at dawn. The canopy stretches before you like a sea of green, undulating in waves that seem to breathe with the wind. Mist rises from somewhere deep below, curling upward through layers of leaves and branches, and the air hums softly with the calls of creatures you cannot see. You are looking at what we have always called wilderness, untouched, primordial, a place where humanity has never truly belonged. But what if we were wrong? What if beneath that green ocean, hidden in plain sight for millennia, there exists evidence of something we never imagined possible? Not cities carved into hillsides or temples rising from clearings, but something far stranger. Something that suggests our ancestors did not conquer the forest by cutting it down, but by rising above it, by building upward into the sky itself. If you're drawn to the kind of history that sleeps between myth and archaeology, the stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about who we were and what we built, then stay with me. And if this resonates with something deep inside you, let me know you're here. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? What corner of the world are you calling home as we wander together through this mystery? Because what we're about to explore isn't just about the Amazon. It's about memory. It's about the possibility that the first cities were not built on Earth at all, but suspended in the air, woven through the canopy like neural pathways through a living brain. And it begins with something simple, something almost absurdly mundane. A mound. In the heart of the Brazilian Amazon, deep within territories that satellites can barely penetrate and where few archaeologists have ventured, there are earthen platforms rising from the forest floor. They are not natural formations. Their edges are too precise, their elevations too deliberate. They stand like silent sentinels, these mounds, scattered across hundreds of miles of jungle, each one approximately the same height, between 15 and 30 meters above the ground. For decades, when they were noticed at all, they were dismissed as anomalies. Ceremonial sites, perhaps, burial grounds, the remnants of agriculture or primitive fortifications. But no one could explain why they appeared in such regularity, such geometric precision, or why they were always built to the same height. The same height, not the height of a temple, not the height of a defensive wall, but the height of the canopy itself. In 2019, a team using LiDAR light detection and ranging technology that can peer through dense vegetation and map the ground beneath, began systematically scanning vast swaths of the Amazon basin. What they found changed everything. The mounds were not isolated. They were networked, aligned, connected by something that had long since vanished but left its signature in the earth itself. Faint depressions, pathways that ran not along the ground but through the air, spanning from platform to platform like threads in an enormous web. Elevated pathways, sky bridges. The forest, it seemed, had been hiding a secret. And that secret whispered of a civilization that did not fight against the jungle but learned to live within its upper reaches, moving through the canopy as easily as we now move through streets and corridors. But if this is true, if the Amazon once held a network of sky bridges connecting platforms that rose to meet the treetops, then everything we believe about the Amazon, about ancient architecture, about the limitations of pre-industrial societies, must be reconsidered. Let us walk carefully through this evidence. Let us examine what has been found, what it suggests, and what it means for the story we tell ourselves about who we are. The platforms themselves are engineering marvels. Constructed from compacted earth, clay, and organic materials, they have endured for what may be thousands of years beneath the relentless assault of tropical weather. Rainforests do not preserve, they consume. Wood rots within decades. Stone is swallowed by roots. Entire structures can vanish in a generation, reclaimed by the green hunger of the jungle. Yet these mounds remain. Their construction required not only labor but knowledge, an understanding of hydrology, of soil composition, of how to build structures that could withstand seasonal flooding and constant moisture without collapsing. The platforms are not merely piles of dirt. They are layered, reinforced, designed with drainage channels and foundations that speak to a sophisticated grasp of engineering principles. And they are everywhere. LiDAR surveys have now identified over 300 such platforms across regions previously thought to be uninhabited wilderness. They cluster in patterns that suggest intentionality, forming geometric networks. Some in grids, others in spirals, still others in lines that stretch for miles through terrain where ground-level travel would have been nearly impossible. Why build in the canopy? The question haunts every analysis. The Amazon floor is dark, humid, teeming with dangers. Predators, insects, diseases that flourish in standing water and thick undergrowth. It is a place where visibility is measured in meters, where movement is slow and exhausting, where the earth itself can betray you with hidden roots and sudden floods. But 30 meters up, in the canopy, the world transforms. There is light. There is air that moves, carrying away the oppressive humidity. There is a highway of branches, interlocking and strong, forming natural pathways that span kilometers. The canopy is a different realm entirely, one that biologists have only recently begun to understand as perhaps the most biodiverse layer of the rainforest, a place where entire ecosystems exist that never touch the ground. And it is navigable. Modern research into canopy ecology has revealed that the upper reaches of the Amazon are not the chaotic tangle we once imagined. They are structured, predictable. Trees grow in patterns. Branches interweave in ways that create natural bridges. Animals, monkeys, sloths, birds, traverse vast distances without ever descending, moving through an arboreal network that functions as efficiently as any road system. Could humans have done the same? The evidence suggests they did. And not just occasionally, not as some desperate survival strategy, but systematically, deliberately, as a way of life. Excavations at several platform sites have uncovered post holes. Deep, reinforced depressions that once held massive wooden beams. The arrangement of these holes indicates structures far larger than simple dwellings. They suggest frameworks designed to support weight, to span distances, to anchor cables or ropes or beams that extended outward from the platform edges. Suspension bridges, walkways, structures that reached into the canopy and connected one platform to another, creating an elevated transit network through the forest. In the traditional narratives of ancient civilizations, we speak of roads. The Romans built theirs straight and stone, conquering distance with engineering and military discipline. The Inca carved theirs into mountainsides, weaving thousands of miles through impossible terrain. The Silk Road was not a single path but a web of routes connecting east and west, enabling trade and cultural exchange across continents. But we never speak of vertical roads, of civilizations that built upward instead of outward, that saw the sky not as a limit but as a frontier. The Amazon platforms suggest precisely that, a civilization that organized itself not along rivers or coastlines, but along the canopy itself, moving through three-dimensional space in ways we have only recently begun to explore with modern architecture. And the more we look, the more coherent the picture becomes. At platform sites in the Upper Xingu Basin, archaeologists have discovered ceramic fragments bearing geometric designs that mirror the spatial layout of the platforms themselves. Spirals, grids, interconnected nodes. These are not decorative patterns. They are maps, schematics, representations of the network as it existed, preserved in clay by people who understood exactly what they had built. There is mathematics here, precision. The distances between platforms are not random. They cluster around specific intervals, suggesting standardized measurements, a common system of planning. Some platforms align with astronomical features, solstices, equinoxes, the rising and setting points of particular stars. Others align with geographic markers, river confluences, mountain peaks visible from the canopy. This was not improvisation. This was design, and it was vast. The full extent of the network remains unknown. Vast regions of the Amazon have never been surveyed with LiDAR, and much of what has been scanned remains unanalyzed, terabytes of data waiting for researchers to sift through. But preliminary estimates suggest that the platform network may have extended across an area equivalent to the size of Great Britain, potentially linking hundreds of communities in a continuous, elevated transit system. Imagine it. Imagine walking out from your platform at dawn, stepping onto a bridge woven from vines and timber, suspended 30 meters above the forest floor. Around you, the canopy stretches in every direction, alive with color and movement. Birds scatter at your approach. Monkeys watch from nearby branches. Below, the ground is a distant shadow, a place you descend to only when necessary. You walk for hours, moving from bridge to bridge, platform to platform, each one a node in the network. Some platforms are small, perhaps home to a single family. Others are enormous, capable of supporting dozens of structures, homes, workshops, communal spaces. You pass others traveling the same routes, carrying goods, sharing news, moving through the forest as easily as we now move through cities. This was not primitive. This was sophisticated. And it required knowledge we are only now beginning to rediscover. If you're still with me, if this image is taking shape in your mind and you want to see where this path leads, then let me know. A simple like tells me you're here, walking this journey with me. And subscribe, because there are more mysteries ahead. More stories that challenge everything we think we know about the past. The construction of sky bridges in a rainforest environment presents engineering challenges that would test even modern technology. The constant moisture, the weight of the structures, the stress from wind and rain, the expansion and contraction of materials with temperature changes, all of these factors must be accounted for. Yet, the platforms themselves reveal solutions that are elegant in their simplicity. Analysis of soil samples from multiple sites shows evidence of organic additives, resins, plant fibers, charcoal, mixed into the earthworks to improve water resistance and structural integrity. These are not techniques we would expect from a primitive society. They are sophisticated applications of material science, the kind of knowledge that comes from generations of experimentation and refinement. The wooden posts found at excavation sites, though long decayed, left traces in the soil that reveal their original dimensions. They were massive, some over 1 meter in diameter, driven deep into the earth and likely extending 20 meters or more into the air. The wood itself, identified through microscopic analysis of remaining fragments, came from species specifically chosen for their strength and resistance to rot. These were not casual choices. They were selections made by people who understood the properties of different timbers and knew exactly which would serve their purposes. And then there are the ropes. In several sites, preserved in anaerobic layers of mud that prevented complete decomposition, archaeologists have found fragments of woven fiber, ropes and cables of extraordinary complexity. Some are simple braids, 3 or 4 strands twisted together. But others are compound structures, dozens of smaller cords woven into larger cables using techniques that would not be rediscovered in Europe until the medieval period. The strongest of these cables, reconstructed from preserved sections, would have been capable of supporting several tons of weight. They were not decorative. They were structural, the actual suspension cables of the bridges themselves, anchored to the massive posts and stretched across open spans between platforms. How far could such bridges extend? Modern suspension bridges using steel cables can span thousands of meters. But these were not steel. They were organic fibers subject to stretching, to degradation, to the limits of materials drawn from the forest itself. Yet the evidence suggests spans of at least 100 meters, distances that would carry a walkway from one platform to another across open canopy, high above the ground, swaying gently with the movement of the trees but stable enough to support regular traffic. We know this because of the wear patterns. At the edges of platforms, where the bridges would have anchored, the soil shows compression marks, grooves worn by centuries of stress from cables pulling against anchor points. These are not the marks of experimental structures built once and abandoned. They are the marks of infrastructure, systems maintained and used over long periods, repaired and reinforced, integral to daily life. And there is more. In recent years, indigenous communities living in remote regions of the Amazon have begun sharing oral traditions that their ancestors kept hidden from outsiders for generations. These stories speak of the airwalkers, people who lived in the time before the forest fell, who built their homes in the sky and traveled through the trees like spirits. For a long time, anthropologists dismissed these accounts as mythology, as symbolic narratives rather than historical memory. But now, in light of the physical evidence, the stories are being re-examined. The Kayapo people, who inhabit regions of the Brazilian Amazon, have legends of the Skypath people, ancestors who knew the secret of building roads through the air. According to their oral tradition, these people were not gods but humans, master builders who understood the language of the forest and could bend it to their will. The stories describe vast cities in the canopy, connected by bridges so fine they seemed invisible from below, like spider silk stretched between trees. The Yanomami tell similar tales. Their word for these ancient people translates roughly as those who walked above, and their stories describe a time when the forest was filled with voices from the sky, when smoke from cooking fires rose not from the ground, but from platforms hidden in the canopy. These are not isolated myths. They appear with variations across dozens of indigenous groups spanning thousands of miles of rainforest. And they share common elements: platforms, bridges, elevated dwellings, people who moved through the canopy as their primary mode of existence. For generations, these stories were all we had. Myths without context, legends without proof. But now the earth itself is confirming what the stories have been saying all along. The platforms are real. The bridges existed. The civilization in the sky was not a dream. And the question that haunts us now is not whether it existed, but why. Why choose such a life? Why build upward when every other civilization we know built outward, spreading across the land, establishing dominance over territory? The answer may lie in the forest itself. The Amazon is not a wilderness. It never was. This is perhaps the greatest misconception of our age, the idea that the rainforest represents untouched nature, a pristine environment unshaped by human hands. Modern research has shattered that illusion. Soil analysis across vast regions reveals signatures of human modification, terra preta, the black earth created by ancient Amazonians through the systematic addition of charcoal, bone, and organic waste. This enriched soil is far more fertile than the natural rainforest substrate, and it exists in concentrations that suggest large-scale agriculture, populations far greater than we ever imagined. The forest itself may be a human creation, or rather a co-creation, a landscape shaped over millennia by people who lived within it, who managed it, who cultivated it not by clearing it but by enhancing it. And the canopy civilization fits perfectly within this paradigm. By building upward, by establishing their primary infrastructure in the canopy, these people could have lived in the forest without destroying it. The platforms required minimal ground clearing. The bridges touched the forest only at their anchor points. Travel through the canopy would have left almost no trace on the forest floor, allowing ground-level ecosystems to flourish even as human civilization thrived above. This was not conquest. This was integration, and it may have been sustainable in ways that no ground-based civilization has ever achieved. Consider the resources. Everything needed for construction, wood, fiber, resin, even food, could be harvested from the canopy itself without depleting it. The upper rainforest regenerates quickly, growing with a vigor that can replace harvested materials within years rather than decades. By rotating harvest sites, by understanding the growth cycles of canopy species, these people could have maintained their infrastructure indefinitely, living in balance with the forest in a way that seems almost miraculous from our modern perspective. And the population such a system could support may have been enormous. If the platform network extended across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, and if each platform cluster supported communities ranging from dozens to hundreds of people, then the total population of the canopy civilization could easily have numbered in the millions, a possibility that forces us to completely reconsider the human history of the Amazon. We have been looking in the wrong place. When archaeologists search for ancient Amazonian civilizations, they look for the markers of settlement we recognize: cleared land, stone structures, signs of agriculture on the ground. But if the people lived in the sky, if their cities rose above the leaf line, then those markers would never appear. They would leave only what we are now finding: platforms, post holes, occasional artifacts that managed to survive in the soil. The civilization itself would have been invisible, hidden within the forest, camouflaged by the very environment it called home. And then it vanished. Somewhere between 800 and 1200 CE, the exact dating remains uncertain, the platform network collapsed. Not slowly, not gradually, but rapidly within a span of perhaps a few generations. The platforms were abandoned. The bridges fell or were deliberately dismantled. The population dispersed, descending to the ground or migrating away entirely. What happened? The answer is written in the layers of sediment, in the pollen records extracted from lake beds, in the climate data reconstructed from tree rings and ice cores. The medieval warm period, a span of several centuries when global temperatures rose significantly, created profound changes in the Amazon basin. Rainfall patterns shifted, rivers changed their courses, and crucially, the canopy itself began to transform. Warmer temperatures and altered precipitation favored different tree species, ones that grew taller, that created denser shade, that did not interlock their branches in the same cooperative networks that had made the sky bridges possible. The forest structure that the canopy civilization depended upon was changing beneath them, slowly at first, then accelerating. And there was disease. Recent analysis of human remains from late-period platform sites shows evidence of epidemics, bone lesions consistent with infectious diseases, mass burials that suggest sudden, catastrophic mortality events. Living in close proximity, moving through shared pathways, the canopy communities would have been extraordinarily vulnerable to contagion. A single outbreak could have swept through the entire network in weeks, devastating populations before anyone understood what was happening. The combination was lethal. Climate change undermining the infrastructure, disease ravaging the population, and perhaps, though this remains speculative, social collapse as the systems that held the network together broke down under stress. Within a few generations, it was over. The survivors descended to the ground, taking with them fragments of memory, stories of the time when their ancestors walked the sky. They adapted, survived, evolved into the indigenous cultures that still inhabit the Amazon today. But the great network, the civilization in the canopy, was gone, and the forest reclaimed everything. This is what rainforests do. They erase, they consume, they grow over the works of humanity with patient, relentless vigor, until nothing remains visible to the casual eye. Temples become hills, roads become creek beds, and sky bridges become nothing at all. Their wooden beams rotting, their fiber cables disintegrating, their existence reduced to whispers in the earth and stories in the dark. If you're feeling something shift inside you as you listen to this, if the image of that lost world is taking shape and you want to go deeper into these mysteries with me, then stay. Subscribe if you haven't, because we're only beginning to understand what was lost. And let me know you're here. Leave a comment. Tell me what you're thinking. Are we alone in wondering about these ghosts in the canopy? But here is where the story becomes truly unsettling. What if the canopy civilization was not unique? What if it was not an isolated phenomenon, a single society that happened to build upward in one corner of the world, but part of something larger? In the past decade, similar structures have been identified in other rainforest regions, platforms and elevated earthworks in the Congo Basin, in Southeast Asia, in New Guinea. The dating is uncertain, the connection speculative, but the parallels are striking. All of them in rainforests, all of them at canopy height, all of them abandoned around the same period. Is it possible that there was a global canopy civilization, a network of societies across the world's tropical forests that chose to build upward, that developed similar technologies independently, or, more unsettling still, that were connected in ways we have not yet discovered? The indigenous myths suggest it. The Kayapo stories speak of travelers who came from the other sky paths, visitors from distant forests who arrived along routes that stretched beyond the horizon. The Yanomami legends describe a time when all the forests were connected, when you could walk from one end of the world to the other without touching the ground. These are old stories, ancient stories, the kind that slip into dream and are dismissed as fantasy. But what if they are memory? In Southeast Asia, the Penan people of Borneo have legends of the Tree Bridge people, ancestors who lived before the forests were cut, who built cities in the canopy that spanned the entire island. They describe structures that sound remarkably similar to what we are finding in the Amazon: platforms, suspension bridges, elevated pathways. In the Congo, similar oral traditions exist among the Mbuti and other forest peoples, stories of the high walkers who lived above the ground and traveled through the trees like spirits. And in every case, the stories end the same way. The civilization fell. The people descended. The forest took back what had been built. If these were isolated myths, we could dismiss them. But they are not isolated. They appear across continents, among peoples with no known historical contact, describing similar structures, similar lifestyles, similar endings. This is the pattern we see again and again in human history. knowledge that appears simultaneously in disparate regions, technologies that emerge independently among cultures separated by oceans and mountains, as if humanity as a whole were remembering something rather than inventing it. And perhaps that is exactly what is happening. Perhaps the Canopy civilization was not a new idea, not an innovation born in the Amazon during the first millennium CE, but a restoration. A remembering of something far older, something that existed long before, in a time we have no records of, in an epoch that left no trace except in the myths we still tell and the faint signatures in the earth that we are only now learning to read. Consider the timeline. The Amazon platforms date to roughly 500 to 1200 CE. But the oral traditions suggest they are remembrances of something older. The stories do not say, "We built the sky paths." They say, "Our ancestors built them," or "the ancient ones who came before." How much before? In 2021, a platform site in the western Amazon was excavated to a depth of over 10 meters, penetrating layers of soil that dated back thousands of years. At the deepest levels, below the foundations of the known platforms, archaeologists found older post holes, earlier structures, evidence of occupation and construction that predated the Canopy network by millennia. The platforms we are finding are not the first. They are the latest iteration, a rebuilding. And if that is true, then we must ask, what were the earlier versions? How far back does this go? And what happened to the first skywalkers, the original builders who conceived of living in the canopy before the forest we know today even existed? The Amazon itself may hold the answer. Core samples taken from deep within the rainforest reveal pollen records going back over 50,000 years. And within those records, there are anomalies, periods when the forest composition changed dramatically, when certain tree species vanished and others flourished, in patterns that do not match natural climate cycles. These shifts suggest management, human influence, the deliberate cultivation of tree species that would create optimal canopy structures, that would grow in interlocking networks, that would support the kind of elevated architecture we are now discovering. If that is true, then the Canopy civilization is not 1,000 years old. It is tens of thousands of years old. And what we are finding in the Amazon is merely its final chapter, the last time humanity tried to live in the sky before the knowledge was lost entirely. This is the pattern. This is what we see across human history. We do not invent. We remember. We rediscover. We rebuild what was lost over and over, each time rising a little higher, falling a little harder until the cycle begins again. The Sumerians did not invent writing. They restored it. The Egyptians did not invent monumental architecture. They remembered it. And the people of the Amazon did not invent the Canopy civilization. They rebuilt it one more time before it was lost again. But why? Why does this knowledge keep slipping away? Why do we rise and fall, build and collapse, remember and forget, in this endless spiral? The answer may be simpler than we want to believe. We are fragile. Civilizations are fragile. Knowledge is fragile. It takes generations to build and only one catastrophe to erase. A climate shift, a disease, a war, a single break in the chain of transmission, and everything we know can vanish, leaving only fragments for future generations to puzzle over. The Canopy civilization understood this. We know they did because they left something behind, something that suggests they knew their time was ending and wanted to preserve what they could. In several platform sites, archaeologists have discovered caches of artifacts buried deliberately, sealed in clay vessels and hidden in the deepest, most protected layers of the earthworks. These caches contain tools, ceramic fragments, and something else, woven fiber samples, preserved in resin, showing the exact techniques used to construct the suspension cables. These are not offerings. They are archives, time capsules, left intentionally for whoever might come after, for whoever might want to rebuild. It is a message across the centuries, a voice from the past saying, "We were here, we built this, and if you are reading this, if you are finding these things, then perhaps you can do it again. Perhaps you can succeed where we failed, and perhaps we can." In recent years, architects and engineers have begun to take seriously the idea of canopy-level infrastructure in rainforest regions. Not as archaeology, but as a solution to modern challenges: how to access and study the forest without destroying it, how to create sustainable communities that integrate with rather than replace natural ecosystems. The designs they are developing look remarkably similar to what we are finding in the Amazon. Platforms anchored to existing tree clusters. Suspension bridges using modern materials but ancient geometries. Elevated pathways that distribute weight and stress in ways that allow the forest beneath to thrive. We are rediscovering the canopy. And as we do, the old knowledge is proving itself. The indigenous techniques for selecting trees, for weaving cables, for designing platforms that work with the forest's natural dynamics, these are not primitive solutions. They are sophisticated, refined, optimized over generations. In some cases, they outperform modern engineering approaches that try to impose rigid structures onto a fluid, living environment. We are learning from the ghosts. At universities across the world, researchers are studying the Amazon platforms, reconstructing the bridge designs, modeling the network's dynamics. And what they are finding is that the canopy civilization may have been sustainable in ways that surpass anything we have achieved. By living in the sky, by building upward, they reduced their ground-level footprint to almost nothing. The forest floor remained intact, its ecosystems undisturbed. The canopy itself, far from being damaged by the infrastructure, may have been enhanced, the platforms creating microclimates, the bridges serving as corridors for animal movement, the entire network functioning as a kind of artificial reef, increasing biodiversity rather than diminishing it. This is not how we think of civilization. We think of conquest, of clearing, of imposing our will upon the landscape. But the canopy builders took a different path. They integrated. They adapted. They became part of the forest rather than its enemy. And for a time it worked. For centuries, perhaps millennia, they thrived. They raised families, created art, passed down knowledge. They lived lives that were, by all evidence, rich and complex, with social structures, trade networks, cultural traditions that we can only glimpse through the fragments they left behind. And then it ended. Not because they failed as a civilization, but because the environment they had adapted to so perfectly changed beneath them. The forest shifted, the climate turned, and the delicate balance they had achieved was broken. This is the lesson. This is what the canopy civilization teaches us. Adaptation is not enough. Sustainability is not enough. Even the most elegant integration with the natural world cannot protect us from forces larger than ourselves, from climate shifts, from pandemics, from the fundamental instability of the systems we depend upon. We are always one change away from collapse, always one catastrophe from losing everything. And yet we build anyway. We must. It is what we do. We are builders. We are creators. We look at the world and imagine it different, imagine it better, and we try to make that vision real. Sometimes we succeed. Sometimes we fail. But we never stop trying. The platforms in the Amazon are not failures. They are attempts. Noble, magnificent attempts to live differently, to find a way of existing that honors both human need and ecological balance. And even though they fell, even though the network collapsed and the people descended, what they built matters. It matters because it shows us what is possible. It matters because it expands our understanding of what humanity can achieve. And it matters because somewhere in those ruins, in those post holes and cable grooves and pottery shards, there is knowledge waiting to be remembered. Knowledge we need now more than ever, because we stand at a similar threshold. Our own civilization is straining against the limits of the environment we have created, and we are searching desperately for alternatives, for ways of living that do not consume the world in the process. The canopy builders offer us a path, not a solution but a direction, a way of thinking about architecture, about infrastructure, about our relationship with the natural world that is fundamentally different from the models we have followed for the past 10,000 years. What if we stopped trying to conquer the landscape and started trying to join it? What if we built upward instead of outward, integrated instead of clearing, adapted to ecosystems instead of replacing them? These are not new questions. They are ancient questions. The same ones the canopy builders must have asked themselves as they stood at the edge of the forest and looked up into the green light filtering through the leaves. And they found answers. Answers that worked for a time. Answers that allowed them to thrive in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. Those answers are still there, waiting in the soil, waiting in the stories, waiting for us to listen. If this feels like more than just history to you, if it feels like something we need to understand right now, then let me know. A like, a comment, a subscription. These are how we find each other in this vast digital forest. And I want to know who else is out there, wandering these same paths, asking the same questions. Because this is not just about the past. It is about the future, about what we choose to remember and what we choose to build. The Canopy civilization is gone, but its memory remains. And memory, as we have learned, is not passive. It is active. It shapes us. It calls to us across the centuries, inviting us to try again, to do better, to reach for the sky one more time. There is a deeper layer to this story, one that we have not yet touched, one that takes us beyond archaeology, beyond history, into something stranger. The myths do not only speak of skywalkers, they speak of why they walked in the sky. According to the Kayapo, the people who built the canopy paths did so because the ground was forbidden. Not dangerous, forbidden. Their stories describe a time when the earth itself was sacred, when to touch it unnecessarily was to violate something holy, something that must be preserved. The Yanomami tell of ancestors who believed the ground belonged to the spirits of the forest, that it was their domain, and that humanity's place was above, in the light, leaving the darkness below to those who dwelled there before we came. These are not practical explanations. They are metaphysical ones, spiritual ones, and they suggest that the canopy civilization was not simply an engineering solution to environmental challenges but a cosmology, a worldview, a way of understanding humanity's place in the universe that required physical separation from the earth. What does it mean to live in the sky? What does it do to a culture, to a people, to spend generations elevated above the ground, moving through light and air, never touching the soil except to plant or harvest, never walking the forest floor except in ritual or necessity? It means you see the world differently. You see the forest not as a barrier but as a medium, not as something to be crossed but as something to be inhabited. You understand the interconnectedness of things, how every branch supports another, how the whole network depends on each part maintaining its integrity. You learn humility, because in the canopy you are always aware of the drop, always conscious that you are suspended, that your safety depends on the strength of the structures you have built and the wisdom of those who built them before you. And you learn perspective. From 30 meters up, the world below becomes abstract. You see patterns that are invisible from the ground, the way rivers curve through the forest, the way clearings form in spirals, the way light and shadow shift through the day. You see the forest as a whole, as a living system, and you understand your place within it. This is what we have lost. Not just the structures, not just the bridges and platforms, but the perspective, the worldview that came from living in the sky. We are ground dwellers now. We see the world horizontally, spreading outward, claiming territory, establishing boundaries. We have forgotten what it means to look up, to build upward, to think in 3 dimensions. And perhaps that forgetting is why we struggle so much with the challenges we face today. Climate change, environmental destruction, social fragmentation, these are horizontal problems. They come from spreading too far, claiming too much, failing to see the whole because we are lost in the parts. The canopy builders saw differently. They had to. Their survival depended on understanding the forest as a system, on recognizing that everything was connected, that damage to one part would ripple through the whole. This was not philosophy. It was lived experience. It was knowledge earned through generations of trial and error, of mistakes and catastrophes, of learning how to exist within a complex system without destroying it. And then they lost it. Not because they wanted to, not because they rejected it, but because the system they had integrated with changed, and they could not change fast enough to keep up. This is the tragedy. This is what haunts me about the canopy civilization. They did everything right. They built sustainably. They lived in balance. They created a way of life that honored both human needs and ecological realities. And it still failed. Not because of anything they did wrong, but because the world is unpredictable. Because climate shifts. Because diseases emerge. Because catastrophe does not care about intentions or wisdom or how elegantly you have solved the problem. And yet they tried. And they left behind enough, just enough, for us to understand what they were attempting. To see the vision they were reaching for. To recognize in their ruins the outline of an answer we are still searching for. What if we tried again? Not to rebuild the Amazon canopy network. That time is gone, that forest has changed, that moment has passed. But to take the principle, the core idea, and apply it to our own challenges. What if we built upward? Not skyscrapers, not vertical sprawl, but integrated structures that work with natural systems instead of replacing them. What if we design cities that enhance ecosystems instead of destroying them? What if we learn to live in 3 dimensions, using the full volume of space available to us, reducing our footprint while increasing our capacity? These are not fantasies. They are possibilities. And they are being explored right now by architects and ecologists and urban planners who are looking at the Amazon platforms and asking, what can we learn from this? The answers are emerging slowly, carefully, with the kind of patience that comes from understanding how much has been lost and how important it is not to lose it again. In Costa Rica, researchers are building canopy research stations using techniques derived from indigenous knowledge. In Singapore, architects are designing vertical forests, buildings wrapped in vegetation that function as ecosystems. In Brazil, communities are working to restore sections of the Amazon using traditional methods, including, experimentally, elevated structures that allow human access without ground-level disturbance. We are beginning to remember, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to see that the canopy builders were not anomalies, not a strange deviation from the normal path of human development, but pioneers, experimenters, visionaries who saw a different way and tried to make it real. They failed in the end. But their failure teaches us more than most successes ever could. It teaches us that sustainability is not a destination but a process. That balance is not static but dynamic. That integration with natural systems requires constant adaptation, constant learning, constant humility in the face of forces larger than ourselves. And it teaches us that memory matters. That what we build, even if it falls, even if it vanishes beneath the green hunger of the forest, leaves traces, echoes, whispers that future generations can hear if they listen carefully enough. We are listening now, and in the listening we are beginning to remember who we were, who we might be again. Let us return for a moment to that image we began with. You standing at the edge of the Amazon at dawn, the canopy stretching before you, breathing with the wind. But now imagine it differently. Imagine that as the sun rises, as the light filters through the mist and touches the treetops, you begin to see shapes. Not trees but structures, platforms emerging from the green, connected by lines that catch the light, bridges, pathways, a network extending as far as you can see. Imagine smoke rising from cooking fires, voices calling from platform to platform, children running across bridges with the fearless confidence of those who have never known any other life, elders sitting in the morning sun, watching the forest wake, teaching the young ones the names of birds, the patterns of weather, the stories of those who came before. Imagine a civilization at its height, thriving, complex, rich with culture and knowledge and life. And then imagine it fading, not violently, not in fire or conquest, but slowly, gradually, as the people realize that the forest is changing, that the trees they depend on are growing differently, that the bridges are becoming harder to maintain, that something fundamental has shifted and they cannot shift with it fast enough. Imagine the decision to descend, the sadness of it, the necessity of it. Imagine them taking what they can carry, tools, seeds, stories, and climbing down to the ground, to a world they barely know, to start again from scratch. And imagine the last person, the very last one, standing on the highest platform, looking out over the network one final time before descending, knowing that everything they are leaving behind will be swallowed by the forest, that in a few generations even the memory will fade to myth. What would they be thinking? What would they want us to know? Perhaps this, that they tried, that they succeeded for a time, that they built something beautiful and functional and sustainable, something that honored both the forest and the human need for community and connection. And perhaps this, that failure is not the end, that what is lost can be found again, that memory persists, encoded in the earth and the stories and the whispers of the wind through the canopy. That we can try again. This is the gift of the canopy civilization. Not a blueprint, we cannot simply copy what they did. The world has changed too much, and we face different challenges. But a permission, a reminder that there are other ways, other paths, other possibilities beyond the ones we have been following. We do not have to build outward endlessly, consuming the landscape, flattening everything to fit our needs. We can build upward. We can integrate. We can learn to live within systems instead of destroying them. The knowledge is there. The examples are there. The memories are there, waiting in the soil and the stories, waiting for us to listen. And we are listening. Across the world, people are asking questions that would have seemed absurd a generation ago. Can we rewild our cities? Can we design buildings that enhance rather than replace ecosystems? Can we live in ways that leave the ground beneath us intact, thriving, independent of our presence? The answer from the Amazon is yes. It has been done. Can be done again. Not easily. Not without effort and ingenuity and generations of learning. But it is possible. And knowing it is possible changes everything. Because possibility is what drives us. It is what gets us up in the morning, what makes us build and create and dream. It is what allowed our ancestors to look at a rainforest and imagine living in the sky. And it is what allows us to look at our current crises and imagine a different future. The platforms are still there, hidden beneath the forest. The post holes and cable grooves and pottery shards are still there, waiting to be found. And the knowledge they represent is still there, encoded in the earth and the trees and the memories of indigenous peoples who never forgot what their ancestors built. We are custodians of that knowledge now. Inheritors of a legacy we barely understand but can still learn from. And perhaps that is the real story here. Not the story of a lost civilization, but the story of found knowledge, of rediscovery, of humanity remembering once again something it forgot. We are always forgetting, and we are always remembering. This is the cycle we live in, the spiral we trace through history. Rising and falling, building and collapsing, learning and losing and learning again. But each time we remember a little more. Each time we rebuild, we build a little better. Each time we learn a little deeper. This is progress. Not linear, not simple, but real. And the canopy civilization is part of that progress. A chapter in the long, complex story of humanity trying to find its place in the world. A chapter that ended in descent and dispersal but left behind enough to teach us, to guide us, to show us what is possible when we dare to think differently. So here we are, standing at the edge of our own forest, looking up at our own canopy, wondering if we have the courage to climb. Do we? That is the question the platforms ask us. That is the challenge left by those who walked the sky before us. Will we build upward? Will we integrate? Will we honor the systems we depend on instead of consuming them? Or will we continue as we have been, spreading outward, flattening, claiming, until we too collapse and descend, leaving only fragments for future generations to puzzle over? The choice is ours, as it always has been, as it always will be, and the forest waits, patient, eternal, ready to reclaim what we build or to support it depending on what we choose. If you've stayed with me to this point on the journey, if these questions are resonating somewhere deep inside you, then you're part of this. Part of the remembering. Part of the possibility. Let me know you're here. A like, a comment, whatever feels right to you. Because these stories connect us, and together, maybe we can learn something our ancestors knew. There is one final piece to this puzzle. One more layer to peel back before we let the silence settle and the story rest. The platforms are not empty. When archaeologists excavate the sites, when they dig down through the layers of compressed earth and clay, they find things that do not belong in tombs or refuse heaps. They find deliberate deposits. Offerings, perhaps, but not to gods. Offerings to the future. Seeds, preserved in ceramic vessels sealed with resin. Thousands of them. Not random seeds, but carefully curated collections. Species that grow well in canopy conditions, that produce strong wood or flexible fiber, that bear fruit or provide medicine. These are seed banks. archives of botanical knowledge, left intentionally protected from decay, waiting. For what? For whoever would come after. For whoever would need to rebuild. For us, in several sites, the seed vessels are accompanied by other artifacts. Tools wrapped in bark, their cutting edges carefully maintained. Samples of woven fiber showing different techniques, different patterns. Clay tablets bearing geometric designs that may be instructions, schematics, maps. This is not grave goods. This is inheritance. The canopy builders knew they were failing. They knew their time was ending. And they made a choice. Instead of despairing, instead of simply abandoning everything, they preserved what they could. They encoded their knowledge in the most durable forms available and hid it where it might survive. In the earth, in the platforms themselves, in the very foundations of what they had built. And here is what makes this unbearably poignant. They were right. The seeds are still viable. After 800 years, after a millennium of submersion in tropical soil, some of those seeds can still germinate. The techniques shown in the fiber samples still work. The designs on the clay tablets still make sense. The knowledge survived. It waited. And now it is being found, being studied, being remembered. This is not an accident. This is a message, a deliberate communication across centuries, from people who understood that civilizations fall but knowledge can endure if someone cares enough to preserve it. They cared. They preserved it. And now we are receiving the message they sent. What do we do with it? That is the question that haunts every researcher who works on these sites. Every archaeologist who uncovers another seed vessel, another tool cache, another fragment of preserved knowledge. Because this is not just academic. This is not just interesting data to be cataloged and published. This is practical information, techniques that work, designs that function, knowledge that could be applied right now to solve problems we are struggling with. And increasingly, it is being applied. In the Brazilian Amazon, conservation groups working with indigenous communities are using seeds from archaeological deposits to restore sections of degraded forest. The species the ancient canopy builders selected for cultivation turn out to be exactly the ones most effective for modern rewilding efforts. Fast-growing, resilient, supportive of diverse wildlife. In universities, engineers are studying the bridge designs, the cable weaving techniques, the platform construction methods. And they are discovering that in many cases, the ancient approaches are superior to modern ones for certain applications. Lighter, more flexible, more adaptable to natural conditions. The knowledge is not just historical. It is current. It is useful. It is needed. And it is spreading. Across the Amazon, across other rainforest regions, people are beginning to experiment with elevated structures again. Not exactly replicating the ancient platforms, but drawing inspiration from them, adapting the principles to modern materials and needs. Canopy research stations, ecotourism platforms, conservation observation posts, even residential structures in remote areas where ground-level building is problematic. The sky paths are being rebuilt. Not as they were, that moment is gone, that civilization has passed, but as they could be, as they might become, a new interpretation of an old idea, a reimagining of what it means to live in the forest. And with each new structure, with each experiment, we learn a little more. We remember a little more. We recover a little more of what was lost. This is how knowledge returns. Not in sudden revelations, not in dramatic rediscoveries, but gradually, piece by piece, through the patient work of people who care enough to listen to the whispers from the past and try to understand what they mean. The canopy builders are speaking to us. Through the platforms and the seeds and the tools they left behind. Through the myths their descendants kept alive. Through the patterns in the earth that LiDAR reveals and the stories that indigenous communities are finally willing to share. They are speaking, and we are finally learning to listen. But there is something else in those messages. Something deeper than techniques and designs and botanical knowledge. There is a philosophy, a worldview, a way of understanding our relationship with the natural world that we have lost and desperately need to recover. The canopy builders did not see themselves as separate from the forest. They did not see nature as something to be conquered or controlled or managed. They saw themselves as part of it, integrated with it, dependent on its health for their own survival. And they structured their entire civilization around that understanding. By living in the canopy, they made their dependence visible, tangible, immediate. Every day they were reminded that their survival depended on the strength of the trees, the health of the ecosystem, the stability of the network that supported them. They could not forget. They could not ignore. They could not pretend that human welfare was somehow separate from ecological welfare. And that forced a kind of humility, a kind of wisdom, a constant awareness of limits, of reciprocity, of the need to give back what you take. This is what we have lost. This is what we need to remember. Not the specific techniques, though those are valuable. Not the exact structures, though those are instructive. But the underlying philosophy, the recognition that we are not separate from the systems we inhabit. That our fate is bound to the fate of the forests, the rivers, the atmosphere, the living planet we call home. The canopy builders knew this. They lived it. And when their time ended, they tried to pass it on. The seed vessels are not just botanical archives. They are symbols, reminders that life continues, that regeneration is possible, that what falls can rise again if someone cares for the seeds. We are those someones now. We are the inheritors, the recipients of the message, the ones standing at the edge of the forest, looking up, wondering if we have the courage to climb. And the answer is yes. We do. We must. Because the challenges we face now are too great to be solved with the old thinking, the horizontal thinking, the thinking that sees the world as something to be conquered and consumed. We need new thinking, or rather, we need old thinking, ancient thinking, the kind of thinking that builds upward, that integrates, that honors the systems we depend on. We need the wisdom of the skywalkers, and it is there, waiting in the earth, waiting in the seeds, waiting in the platforms that rise from the forest floor like silent prayers to a future they hoped would come. That future is now. We are that future, and we have a choice to make. What if the fall was not the end? What if the descent from the canopy was not failure but transformation? Not collapse but evolution? This is the final twist in the story, the final layer. And it is, perhaps, the most important. Because when we look at the archaeological record, when we trace the timeline of the Amazon platforms from their height to their abandonment, we do not see catastrophe. We see transition. The people did not die out. They adapted. They moved. They changed. And in the process, they carried the knowledge with them. The indigenous cultures of the Amazon today, the Kayapo, the Yanomami, the Munduruku, the Ashaninka, and dozens of others, are not the remnants of a collapsed civilization. They are its descendants, its inheritors, its continuation. They live differently now, on the ground, in longhouses and villages, adapted to a different forest, a different climate, a different world. But they carry the memory. In their stories, yes, but also in their practices. The way they move through the forest, silently, efficiently, using established pathways and natural landmarks. The way they harvest resources, selectively, sustainably, with deep knowledge of growth cycles and ecosystem dynamics. The way they build temporary structures that can be relocated as needed, that work with the forest rather than against it. These are not primitive survival strategies. They are sophisticated techniques refined over thousands of years. And they descend directly from the canopy civilization, adapted and evolved but fundamentally continuous. The Skywalkers did not disappear. They descended. And in descending, they became something new while remaining connected to what they were. This is resilience. This is adaptation. This is survival in its deepest, truest form. And it teaches us something crucial about our own moment in history. We too are facing collapse. Not maybe, not someday, but now. Our own civilization is straining, cracking, showing signs of terminal stress. Climate change, resource depletion, social fragmentation, the markers are everywhere. And we are afraid. Afraid of what collapse means. Afraid of losing what we have built. Afraid of descending from our own heights into something unknown. But the canopy builders show us that collapse does not have to mean ending. Can mean transformation. Can mean adaptation. It can mean evolution into something different but continuous, something that carries forward the essential knowledge even as the forms change. This is not a comforting message. It does not promise that everything will be fine, that we can continue as we are. But it is a hopeful one. It says, you will survive. You will change. And if you are wise, if you prepare, if you preserve what matters, you will carry forward the knowledge that future generations will need. The seed vessels are the proof. The deliberate archives, the careful preservation, the message sent across centuries. The canopy builders knew they were failing, and they prepared for it, not by trying to prevent the inevitable, not by clinging to what was, but by ensuring that what they had learned would not be lost entirely. They let go, but they held on to what mattered. This is wisdom, this is courage, and this is what we must learn to do. We cannot prevent the changes coming. The climate is shifting. The ecosystems are transforming. The structures we have built are straining. And at some point, something will break. But we can prepare. We can preserve. We can encode our knowledge in forms that will survive. Not just in books and databases, which are fragile and dependent on infrastructure, but in practices, in stories, in seeds, in the memories of communities that know how to live with less. We can become the ancestors that future generations will thank. Or we can fail to prepare, fail to preserve, and leave nothing but ruins for those who come after to puzzle over. The choice is ours. And the canopy builders, silent in their platforms, patient in their seed vessels, are showing us the way. If you're still here, if you've walked this entire path with me through the forest and the ruins and the memories, then you understand. You feel it. The weight of this. The responsibility. The possibility. We are not separate from those ancient people. We are them. We are their continuation, their inheritors, their future. And what we do now matters. Not just to us, but to all the generations that will come after, who will look back at this moment and wonder, did they understand? Did they prepare? Did they care enough to preserve what mattered? Let them see that we did. Let them see that we listened. Let them see that when we found the platforms and the seeds and the stories, we understood the message and we acted on it. In the end, we returned to the beginning. You standing at the edge of the forest, the canopy stretching before you, the mist rising, the light filtering through. But you are not just observing now. You are participating. You are part of the story, part of the continuity that stretches back thousands of years and forward into an unknown future. You are the inheritor, the listener, the one who found the message and understood it. And now you have a choice. You can walk away. You can treat this as an interesting story, a fascinating historical curiosity, and return to your life unchanged. Or you can let it change you. You can let the knowledge of the canopy builders shift something inside you. You can start thinking differently about your relationship with the natural world. You can start looking up instead of only outward. You can start asking, how can I integrate? How can I reduce my footprint? How can I live in a way that honors the systems I depend on? These are not abstract questions. They are practical ones. And the answers are available in the archaeological record, in indigenous knowledge, in the growing body of research into sustainable architecture and ecological design. The sky paths are waiting to be rebuilt, not just in the Amazon but everywhere, in our cities, in our communities, in our individual lives. We can build upward. We can integrate. We can learn to live differently. And we must, because the forest is still changing. The climate is still shifting. And the systems we depend on are still under stress. We are living through our own version of what the canopy builders experienced. Environmental transformation happening faster than we can adapt to. But unlike them, we have their example. We have their knowledge. We have the benefit of their experience, their mistakes, their successes. We have the seed vessels. And if we are wise, if we are humble, if we are willing to learn from those who came before, we can do better. We can adapt faster. We can preserve more. We can ensure that when our own descendants look back at this moment, they will see not just collapse but transformation. Not just ending but beginning. The platforms rise from the forest floor. The post holes mark where the bridges once stood. The seed vessels wait in the earth. And we stand at the edge, looking up, wondering, will we climb? The answer is already being written in the experimental structures going up across the Amazon. in the conservation projects drawing on ancient knowledge, in the communities learning to live differently, in the researchers decoding the messages left in clay and seed and story. We are climbing, slowly, carefully, learning as we go. And with each step upward, we remember a little more. We understand a little more. We become a little more like those who walked the sky before us. This is not the end of the story. It is the continuation. The Canopy civilization did not fall. Transformed. It descended, adapted, and continued. And now it is. Rising again in new forms with new knowledge but connected to the old wisdom. We are the Skywalkers now. Or we can be if we choose. And the choice is made in small moments. In the decision to learn about indigenous practices. In the choice to support conservation efforts. In the willingness to change how we live, how we build, how we relate to the world around us. Each small choice is a seed planted. Each act of preservation is a message sent forward. Each effort to integrate rather than conquer is a bridge built into the future. And together, those seeds and messages and bridges form a network. Not visible yet, not complete, but growing. Spreading. Rising. The new canopy. Built not just of wood and fiber, but of knowledge and memory and will. Built by all of us who choose to listen to the whispers from the past and act on what they tell us. This is the gift of the Skywalkers. Not just the platforms and the seeds and the techniques, but the vision, the possibility, the proof that humanity can live differently, can build sustainably, can integrate with rather than destroy the systems that support us. They did it once. We can do it again. And perhaps this time we will not fall. Or if we do, we will fall gracefully with preparation, with preserved knowledge, with seeds planted for those who come after. Perhaps this time we will learn the lesson completely, that we are not separate from the forest, from the rivers, from the atmosphere, from the living planet, that our fate is woven into the fate of all living things, that when we must build with that understanding always in our minds. The platforms in the Amazon are calling to us. The seed vessels are opening. The stories are being told again, and we are listening. Finally, after centuries of forgetting, we are remembering. We are the inheritors of the Skywalkers, and we carry their legacy forward, into the canopy, into the light, into the future that rises above the forest floor and stretches, green and breathing, as far as the eye can see. But there is something we have not yet spoken of. Something that lingers at the edges of the story, whispered in the myths but never fully explained. Why did they build at that exact height? Why 30 meters? Why the canopy specifically and not higher or lower? The practical answers are clear. The canopy is where the light is, where the air moves, where the natural highways of branches create pathways. It is the most habitable layer of the rainforest for anyone choosing to live above the ground. But the myths suggest something else. Something that speaks not to practicality but to perception, to consciousness itself. The Kayapo stories describe the canopy as the place where the world opens. The Yanomami speak of it as the threshold between earth and sky, a liminal space where human awareness expands, where the boundaries between self and forest begin to blur. These are not merely poetic descriptions. They suggest that living in the canopy changed something fundamental about how these people experienced reality. Modern neuroscience gives us clues as to why. Studies of humans living at elevation, particularly in environments surrounded by vast natural spaces, show measurable changes in brain activity. The constant three-dimensional awareness required to navigate elevated spaces strengthens spatial reasoning. The panoramic views, the ability to see great distances, alters perception of time and scale. And the ever-present reminder of gravity, of the drop, creates a heightened state of mindfulness that becomes, over generations, a baseline mode of consciousness. The canopy builders would have lived in this state perpetually. Every movement would have required awareness. Every step would have demanded presence. The mind could not wander, could not drift into distraction, because distraction meant danger. And over time, over generations, this constant awareness would have become not a burden but a gift, a way of being in the world that we, living at ground level, insulated by concrete and cars and climate control, can barely imagine. They were awake in a way we are not. This is what the myths are trying to tell us. This is what the place where the world opens means. Living in the sky did not just change how they moved through space. It changed how they perceived themselves, how they understood consciousness, how they related to the living world around them. And there is evidence for this in the artifacts. Among the ceramic fragments found at platform sites, there are recurring motifs, spirals, fractals, patterns that suggest altered states of consciousness. These are not unique to the Amazon. Similar designs appear in art created by cultures known to use plant medicines, to engage in ritualistic practices aimed at expanding awareness. The Canopy civilization, it seems, was not just building infrastructure. They were cultivating consciousness. And the canopy itself may have been integral to that cultivation. At 30 meters elevation, surrounded by the forest, suspended between earth and sky, the human nervous system enters a unique state. You are too high to feel grounded, yet not so high as to lose connection to the living world. You exist in a space of pure relationship, to the trees that support you, to the air that surrounds you, to the vast network of life that extends in every direction. You become the bridge, the connection, the awareness that links earth and sky. This is what they were building toward. Not just physical bridges, but metaphysical ones. Not just a civilization, but a consciousness, a way of being human that was fundamentally different from what came before or what has come after. And when the platforms fell, when the people descended, this consciousness descended with them. But it did not disappear entirely. The indigenous peoples of the Amazon today still carry traces of it. In their ceremonies, in their use of plant medicines, in their understanding of the forest as a living, conscious entity with which humans can communicate. These are not primitive superstitions. They are the remnants of a sophisticated epistemology, a way of knowing that was refined over millennia of living at the threshold between earth and sky. We have lost this. We have forgotten what it means to exist in that liminal space, to cultivate awareness as carefully as we cultivate crops, to understand consciousness not as something that happens inside our heads, but as something that emerges from our relationship with the world. The Canopy civilization remembered, and they tried to preserve it not just in seeds and tools, but in practices, in ceremonies, in ways of being that could be passed down even after the platforms fell. Some of those practices survive, carried forward by indigenous communities who never stopped walking the threshold, even after they descended to the ground. Kept alive by shamans and elders who understood that what was lost physically could still be accessed mentally, spiritually, through intentional practice. This is the deepest gift of the Canopy builders. Not architecture or engineering, but a map of consciousness. A reminder that awareness itself can be cultivated, expanded, refined. That humans are capable of modes of perception far richer than what we normally experience in our modern, ground-level, distracted lives. And perhaps this is what we need most. Not just sustainable infrastructure, not just ecological wisdom, but a remembering of how to be awake, how to be present, how to exist in conscious relationship with the living world. The platforms can teach us this if we let them, not by rebuilding them exactly as they were, but by understanding what they made possible, what they enabled, what they cultivated in the people who walked them. We can build our own thresholds, our own liminal spaces, our own places where the world opens. They will not look like the Amazon platforms. They will be adapted to our time, our environment, our needs. But they can serve the same purpose, to lift us out of the horizontal, the habitual, the half-asleep modes we normally inhabit, and into something more awake. This is the invitation. This is what the Canopy builders are offering us across the centuries. Not just knowledge of how to build, but knowledge of how to be, how to perceive, how to exist as conscious participants in the living world rather than unconscious consumers of it. And the forest waits, as it always has, ready to teach us if we are willing to climb. There is a particular kind of silence in the Canopy, not the absence of sound, but a quality of quiet that exists alongside the calls of birds, the rustle of leaves, the distant thunder of howler monkeys marking territory. It is the silence of distance, of elevation, of separation from the dense, muffling undergrowth that absorbs sound at ground level. In the Canopy, sound travels differently. Voices carry, calls echo. The acoustic environment is shaped by open air and the architecture of branches, creating a natural amplification that would have allowed the platform dwellers to communicate across vast distances. This changes everything about how community functions. On the ground, human settlements are limited by line of sight, by the thickness of vegetation, by the difficulty of movement. Communication beyond immediate proximity requires runners, messengers, physical travel. But in the canopy, with clear sight lines and sound that carries, the entire network becomes one extended community. A person standing on a platform can see a dozen others. A call from one can be heard by many. Information travels not through discrete channels but through the network itself, spreading organically, reaching everyone simultaneously. This is not hierarchy. This is distributed awareness. And it suggests a form of social organization fundamentally different from what we know. Ground-based civilizations tend toward centralization. Cities with centers, capitals with rulers, power structures that flow from the top down, from the palace to the provinces. But a canopy civilization, with its distributed network and acoustic transparency, would naturally tend toward something else. Something more like what we now call distributed consensus. Collective decision-making, networked intelligence. Everyone can see everyone. Everyone can hear everyone. There is no center, no single point of control. There are only nodes in a network, each connected to many others, each part of the whole. This is democracy in its purest form. Not representative democracy where power is delegated, but participatory democracy, where everyone has voice, where decisions emerge from conversation rather than being imposed from above. And the archaeological evidence supports this. Among the platforms excavated so far, none show signs of being significantly larger or more elaborate than others in ways that would suggest rulership. There are no palaces, no temples that dominate the landscape, no burial sites that indicate a ruling elite. Instead, the platforms are remarkably uniform. Yes, some are larger, capable of supporting more structures, but the construction techniques are the same. The materials are the same. The design principles are the same. This is a civilization built on equality. On the principle that every node in the network is essential, that none is more important than others. And perhaps this is why they succeeded for as long as they did. Not because they had strong leaders or powerful armies or centralized control, but because they had something else. Something harder to define but perhaps more resilient. They had trust. They had reciprocity. They had a social structure that emerged from the network itself rather than being imposed upon it. Think about what this means practically. If a bridge between two platforms needs repair, who decides? In a hierarchical society, the decision would flow from some central authority. But in a distributed network, the decision emerges from conversation between the affected communities. Those who use the bridge, who depend on it, who understand its condition, they are the ones who decide. This is not chaos. It is self-organization, and it is extraordinarily efficient. Modern complexity science has shown us that distributed networks, when properly structured, can outperform hierarchical systems in adaptability, resilience, and problem-solving. They respond faster to changing conditions. They route around failures. They distribute risk and distribute benefit in ways that centralized systems cannot. The canopy civilization, whether consciously or through evolutionary trial and error, discovered these principles thousands of years before we began to formalize them mathematically. They built a society that functioned like a neural network, like a forest itself, where intelligence emerges from the interactions between nodes rather than being concentrated in a single processing center. And when crisis came, when the climate shifted and disease spread, this structure may have actually slowed the collapse. In a centralized system, the fall of the capital means the fall of the civilization. But in a distributed network, there is no capital to fall. Nodes can fail individually without bringing down the whole. Communities can adapt locally to changing conditions without waiting for central directives. The canopy civilization did not collapse all at once. Different regions descended at different times, over a period of generations. This is what we would expect from a distributed system responding to distributed stresses. Some communities may have held on longer than others, maintaining their platforms even as neighbors descended. Some may have experimented with solutions, trying to adapt the infrastructure to the changing forest. And when those experiments failed, when descent became inevitable, the knowledge was distributed widely enough that it survived in multiple places, carried by multiple communities. This is resilience encoded in structure. Not the resilience of strength of being able to withstand shocks, but the resilience of flexibility, of being able to adapt, to change, to survive in new forms. And it worked. The civilization fell, but the people survived. The platforms were abandoned, but the knowledge was preserved. The network collapsed, but the culture continued. This is what we need to understand. This is what they are teaching us. Resilience is not about building stronger fortresses, thicker walls, more powerful centers. It is about distribution, about networks, about creating systems where failure at one point does not cascade through the whole, where adaptation can happen locally, where intelligence emerges from relationship rather than being imposed from above. Our modern world is extraordinarily centralized. Power concentrates in capitals, in corporations, in technological platforms controlled by single entities. We build tall instead of building wide, and we assume that height equals strength. But the canopy builders understood something we have forgotten. True strength comes from distribution, from networks, from creating systems where every node matters, where intelligence is distributed, where resilience emerges from structure itself. They built it once. And it worked for a very long time until the environment itself changed beyond their capacity to adapt. But the principle remains. The knowledge remains. And we can apply it now to our own systems, our own structures, our own ways of organizing human cooperation. Not by copying the platforms exactly, but by understanding what made them work. What allowed a civilization to thrive for centuries without centralized control, without hierarchy, without the power structures we assume are necessary for complex society. They are not necessary. They are one option, and perhaps not the best one. The canopy civilization offers us another option, another way, and in our time of crisis, when centralized systems are proving inadequate to the challenges we face, perhaps it is time to listen to what the platforms are telling us. Distribute, connect, network, allow intelligence to emerge rather than imposing it. Trust in reciprocity rather than enforcing hierarchy. Build the canopy, not just physically but socially, culturally, structurally. This is the path forward, and it has been waiting for us, hidden in the forest, for centuries. Let us speak now of what was grown in the canopy, of the gardens that hung in the air, the cultivation that happened at elevation, the agriculture that fed a civilization without touching the ground. Because they ate, they thrived, and the food came from somewhere. At first, researchers assumed the canopy dwellers must have descended regularly to tend ground-level gardens, to hunt, to gather. But the platforms tell a different story. Soil analysis reveals something unexpected: layers of enriched earth, deliberately created, existing not on the ground but on the platforms themselves. This is terra preta, the black earth of Amazonia, but elevated, transported upward, maintained at height. They were gardening in the sky. This is not as impossible as it sounds. The canopy provides everything needed for cultivation. Sunlight far better than what reaches the forest floor, constant humidity, protection from ground-level pests and floods, and the platform surfaces, large enough to support structures, were large enough to support gardens. But what they grew was specific, adapted, chosen for conditions that exist only at elevation. Among the preserved seeds found in ceramic vessels, researchers have identified dozens of species. Some are familiar varieties of cassava, sweet potato, peppers, but others are not. They are canopy specialists, plants that thrive at height, that have evolved to grow in the pockets of soil that accumulate in tree forks, in the cups of bromeliads, in the decomposing matter that collects on broad branches. The canopy builders were not just using these plants. They were cultivating them, selecting varieties, breeding for specific traits, creating an agricultural system adapted specifically for elevated conditions. This is sophisticated horticulture, and it suggests that the platforms were not just living spaces but productive spaces, farms in the air, gardens woven into the fabric of the canopy itself. Imagine walking across a bridge and seeing not just platforms but terraces. Levels of cultivation, green with growing things, tended by people who understood that food could be produced not by clearing the forest but by integrating with it, by using vertical space, by creating gardens that enhanced rather than replaced the natural canopy. This is three-dimensional agriculture, and it may have been far more productive than we imagine. Modern experiments in vertical farming, in stack cultivation, have shown that producing food upward rather than outward can yield far more per unit of land. The canopy builders discovered this principle empirically, out of necessity, and built an entire agricultural system around it. And there is more, because the gardens were not just for food. Among the seed species there are medicines, psychoactives, plants used in ceremony and healing. The canopy is rich in these, the ayahuasca vine, various datura species, plants whose chemical compounds affect consciousness, perception, healing. The canopy builders cultivated these deliberately, not hidden away, not secret, but integrated into the gardens themselves, part of the everyday landscape of cultivation. This tells us something about their culture, about what they valued, about the relationship between agriculture and consciousness, between growing food and growing awareness. They did not separate these things. The gardens that fed the body also fed the mind. The platforms that supported physical life also supported spiritual life. Everything was integrated, woven together, part of a whole that did not distinguish between practical and sacred. This is what we have lost. This separation we have created between the utilitarian and the meaningful, between work and worship, between survival and transcendence. The canopy builders lived in a world where these were not separate, where tending a garden was both practical necessity and spiritual practice, where the plants that fed you also connected you to deeper layers of reality. And the canopy itself facilitated this integration. At elevation, with perspective, with awareness, the act of gardening becomes meditation. You are conscious of the network, the way water moves, the way nutrients cycle, the way insects pollinate, the way everything connects. You cannot garden mechanically, mindlessly, because you are too aware of the complexity, the interdependence, the living system you are part of. You garden with consciousness, and in doing so, you cultivate consciousness itself. This is the gift they are offering us. Not just techniques for growing food at elevation, though those are valuable, but a way of understanding agriculture itself as a practice of awareness, of relationship, of conscious participation in living systems. We have turned farming into industry, into extraction, into something done to the land rather than with it. And we are paying the price in depleted soils, in poisoned water, in food that nourishes the body but starves something else. The canopy builders show us a different way, where agriculture enhances the ecosystem, where cultivation increases biodiversity, where growing food is an act of creation that feeds not just bodies but cultures, communities, consciousness. This is possible. It has been done. And it can be done again. Not by rebuilding the platforms exactly, though that may come, but by understanding the principles. By recognizing that food production does not have to mean clearing, flattening, simplifying. It can mean integrating, layering, complexifying. We can grow food in 3 dimensions. We can cultivate on walls, on roofs, in vertical gardens that use space currently wasted. We can select for species adapted to these conditions, just as the canopy builders did. We can create agricultural systems that are productive and beautiful and consciousness expanding all at once. This is not fantasy. This is emerging reality. Urban farmers, vertical garden designers, permaculture practitioners, they are already doing this, already rediscovering principles the canopy builders knew intimately. And as they do, as we do, we are not inventing something new. We are remembering. We are restoring. We are finding our way back to knowledge that was lost when the platforms fell and the people descended. The seeds are still there, waiting in the earth. Some literally, preserved in those ceramic vessels, viable after centuries. Others metaphorically, principles and practices encoded in the patterns of cultivation, in the choices of species, in the structure of the gardens themselves. We are inheriting those seeds now. And it is our responsibility to plant them, to see what grows, to discover if we can cultivate not just in the canopy but as the canopy, distributed, networked, integrated, aware. This is the agriculture of the future. And it looks remarkably like the agriculture of the deep past, rising from the forest floor, reaching toward light, suspended between earth and sky. We must speak of the children, of what it meant to be young in the canopy, to grow up in a world where the ground was a distant abstraction and the sky was home. This is not a small thing. Childhood shapes everything: how we perceive space, how we understand danger, how we relate to the world around us. And children who grew up in the platforms would have developed in ways fundamentally different from ground-dwelling humans. Think about it. A child's first steps, taken not on solid ground but on wooden platforms 30 meters above the earth. The first instinctive awareness not of falling down but of falling off. The constant calibration of movement, balance, spatial awareness that would have been necessary simply to exist safely in that environment. This would have created brains wired differently. Neural pathways developed for three-dimensional navigation. Spatial reasoning enhanced to levels we can barely imagine. And perhaps most significantly, a relationship with gravity that was intimate, conscious, ever-present. Ground-dwelling children take the earth for granted. It is always there, solid, reliable, requiring no thought. But canopy children would have been acutely aware that nothing is solid, that everything depends on structure, on maintenance, on the integrity of the network that holds you. This creates a different kind of consciousness. One that understands interdependence not as abstract concept but as lived reality. That knows viscerally that individual survival depends on collective maintenance, that the network must be tended or it will fail. And the archaeological record suggests that children were not just protected in this environment. They were integral to it. Among the artifacts found at platform sites, there are tools sized for small hands. Teaching materials, simplified versions of complex weaving patterns, practice cables, miniature platform models. These are not toys. They are educational tools, designed to train children in the skills they would need as adults. The canopy civilization understood something we are only now rediscovering. That children are not just future adults to be protected and educated. They are present participants capable of real contribution, of learning through doing rather than through abstract instruction. Canopy children would have been apprenticed early, learning to weave cables by helping to make them, learning to read the forest by moving through it, learning to maintain the platforms by participating in their maintenance. This is not exploitation. This is integration. This is recognizing that learning happens through relationship, through participation, through being part of something real rather than being isolated in artificial environments designed for safety. And it would have created something remarkable. Children who were genuinely capable, who understood consequence, who could navigate complexity, who carried real knowledge rather than abstract information. We have lost this. Our children grow up isolated from real participation, trained in classrooms divorced from reality, learning through simulation and abstraction rather than through genuine engagement with living systems. And we wonder why they struggle, why they seem unmoored, anxious, uncertain. We have removed them from the network, from genuine participation, and then we are surprised when they fail to develop the capabilities that only come from being part of something real. The canopy builders understood this. And the proof is in what happened when the platforms fell. The children who descended with their parents did not lose the knowledge. They carried it forward, because they had not learned it abstractly in classrooms from books. They had learned it kinesthetically, through their bodies, through experience embedded so deeply it became part of who they were. This is how knowledge survives collapse. Not in libraries or databases which are fragile, dependent on infrastructure, but in bodies, in practices, in children who know how to do things because they have done them, who carry forward capabilities that can be passed to their own children through demonstration and participation. This is living knowledge, and it is remarkably resilient. The indigenous communities of today's Amazon still carry this. They still train their children through participation, through genuine involvement in the work of survival and culture. And those children grow up with capabilities that seem remarkable to us, raised as we are in protective isolation. They can navigate the forest in ways we cannot imagine. They can identify plants, read weather, understand ecosystems with an intimacy that comes not from study but from relationship. Because they were never isolated from it. They were always part of it. This is what the Canopy civilization is teaching us about education, about childhood, about how humans learn. Not through protection and abstraction, but through participation and relationship. Not by removing children from the world to keep them safe, but by integrating them into it in ways that are appropriate to their age and capability. We can do this. We must do this. Because the children we are raising now will inherit the collapse we are creating. And they will need capabilities we are failing to give them, not information, not abstract knowledge, but genuine skills, real relationships with living systems, kinesthetic understanding of how things work. They need to learn to tend gardens, to maintain structures, to work with their hands and bodies in ways that create real value. They need to understand interdependence not as concept but as reality. They need to develop the spatial awareness, the physical capability, the practical knowledge that will allow them to adapt when the systems we depend on fail. The Canopy builders gave their children this. And those children survived the collapse, carried forward the knowledge, became the ancestors of cultures that still thrive today. We can give our children the same gift. Not by rebuilding the platforms, though that may come, but by understanding what made Canopy childhood valuable. Participation, relationship, integration with living systems, learning through doing rather than through abstraction. This is not about returning to some imagined primitive past. It is about recovering principles that work, that create capable humans, that prepare children for the actual world they will inherit rather than for some fantasy of permanent stability. The platforms are teaching us, through the tools sized for small hands, through the evidence of children working alongside adults, through the proof that knowledge passed this way survives, endures, carries forward even when civilizations fall. We are those children now. Inheritors of knowledge we must learn to carry forward. And if we are wise, we will teach our own children the same way, not through protection and abstraction, but through participation and relationship. This is how knowledge survives. This is how cultures endure. This is how we prepare the next generation for the world that is coming, the world where adaptation and capability will matter far more than credentials and information. The Canopy builders knew this, and they left us the proof, written in tools and platforms and the survival of their descendants. Now we must learn from it, before it is too late. There is a question we have not yet asked. A question that may be the most important of all. What did they see from up there? Not just physically, we know what they saw physically. The endless green of the canopy, the mountains in the distance, the rivers curving through the forest like silver veins, the stars at night, unobscured by the dense undergrowth, brilliant in the darkness. But what did they understand? What patterns did elevation reveal that remain hidden to ground dwellers? The forest, from above, is not what it seems from below. From the ground, it appears chaotic, random, a tangle of growth without pattern or purpose. But from the canopy, from platforms 30 meters high, different patterns emerge. You see the spirals, the way clearings form and fill in recurring cycles, the way certain tree species cluster, creating patches of different canopy height that move across the landscape over decades like slow waves. You see the watercourses before they become visible at ground level, marked by changes in canopy color, in leaf shape, in the behavior of mist. You see animal highways, the preferred routes of migration and movement, written in the architecture of branches. And you see time differently. From the ground, the forest seems eternal, unchanging. But from above, you watch it breathe. You see trees fall and gaps open. Watch pioneer species rush in. See the slow succession from light-loving fast growers to shade-tolerant climax species. You watch the forest remake itself, constantly, in patterns that repeat at scales from individual tree to entire region. You see the forest as a living system, and you understand that you are not separate from it but part of it. One more species adapting, changing, participating in the endless dance of growth and decay and renewal. This is ecological knowledge at a level we are only beginning to reach with satellite imagery and long-term studies. But the canopy builders had it experientially, directly, as part of lived reality. And it shaped everything about how they understood the world. They would have known, with certainty, that nothing is permanent, that the forest is always changing, that what seems solid is actually fluid, unfolding in patterns too slow for ground-level perception but obvious from elevation and over time. They would have understood adaptation not as concept but as visible process, would have watched species shift their ranges as climate fluctuated, would have seen the consequences of drought and flood and fire written in canopy patterns that persisted for generations. They would have understood their own civilization as part of this flux. Not permanent, not special, but one more adaptation, one more pattern in the endless unfolding. This is wisdom. This is the understanding that comes from perspective, from elevation, from seeing patterns that remain invisible to those too close to the ground. And it may have saved them in the end. Or rather, it may have allowed them to descend with grace when descent became necessary. Because they understood impermanence. They knew that nothing lasts. They could see, in the changing patterns of the canopy, that the forest was shifting, that the conditions that made the platforms possible were fading. And so they prepared. They created the seed vessels. They encoded their knowledge. They descended before catastrophe forced them down, while they still had time to carry what mattered. This is wisdom we desperately need now. We are ground dwellers, unable to see the patterns, unable to perceive the changes that are obvious from elevation and over time. We cling to permanence, to the fantasy that what we have built will last, that we can maintain current conditions indefinitely. But the canopy builders would look at our civilization and see what they saw in their own. Adaptation in process, patterns shifting, conditions changing. They would recognize the signs that we are ignoring, the evidence that our current mode of existence is becoming untenable. And they would prepare, not with denial, not with desperate attempts to hold back the inevitable, but with realistic acceptance and practical adaptation. This is the gift of elevation, the gift of perspective, the ability to see what is actually happening rather than what we wish were happening. We need this now. We need to rise high enough to see the patterns, to understand the trajectories, to recognize that change is not catastrophe but opportunity. Opportunity to adapt, to evolve, to become something new. The platforms offered this to the people who built them. Not just shelter, not just infrastructure, but perspective. A way of seeing that made wisdom possible. And we can create our own version of this. Not necessarily by building at elevation, though that may be part of it, but by developing the kind of long-term, systemic thinking that comes from perspective. We can study satellite imagery, track changes over decades, model systems at scales that reveal patterns invisible at ground level. We can learn to see the forest as the canopy builders saw it, as living system constantly changing, unfolding in patterns we can understand. If we rise high enough to perceive them, we can develop the wisdom of elevation without physically living there. Though perhaps in the end we will need both. The physical experience and the mental framework. The actual platforms and the metaphorical ones. Because wisdom is not just intellectual. It is embodied. It comes from experience as much as from analysis. And the canopy builders had both, the physical experience of elevation and the cultural framework to interpret what that experience revealed. This is what we are working to recover. Not just their techniques but their perspective. Not just what they built but what they saw. And as we do, as we rise, physically or metaphorically, to see the patterns they saw, we begin to understand their choices. Why they built as they did. Why they descended when they did. Why they preserved what they preserved. They were not primitive. They were not struggling to survive. They were sophisticated, aware, capable of seeing patterns and responding to them with flexibility rather than rigidity. They were, in many ways, more advanced than we are. Not technologically, but epistemologically. They knew things we have forgotten. They saw things we cannot see. And they left us the platforms as invitation, as reminder, as challenge. Will you climb? Will you rise high enough to see? Will you develop the perspective that allows wisdom? The forest is waiting. The patterns are visible for those who rise high enough to see them. And the platforms, silent in the green, are teaching us still. Let us speak now of the bridges themselves. Not as infrastructure but as metaphor, as symbol, as philosophical statement about what it means to be human. A bridge is a paradox. connects but only by spanning emptiness, creates path where there is no ground. It is simultaneously solid and suspended, permanent and precarious, achievement and risk. The canopy builders lived their entire lives on bridges, not just crossing them but inhabiting them, making homes on platforms connected by spans that could not exist without tension, without the constant pull of cable against post, without the active maintenance of structure. This is existence as conscious act. Life that requires attention, maintenance, participation. You cannot simply exist on a bridge. You must actively maintain your existence, moment by moment, through awareness and action. This is what ground dwelling allows us to forget. The ground is always there, requiring nothing from us. We can sleepwalk through life unconscious, assuming that existence simply continues without effort. But the canopy builders could not afford such forgetting. Every bridge reminded them, existence is not automatic. It is maintained. It requires attention. Fail to attend and you fall. This is brutal honesty. And it is also liberation. Because when you understand that existence is maintained rather than automatic, you become conscious of what maintains it. You see the network. You understand interdependence. You recognize that your life depends not just on your own efforts, but on the efforts of everyone who maintains the bridges you cross, tends the platforms you visit, keeps the network functioning. You become conscious of debt. Not financial debt, but existential debt, the recognition that you owe your existence to others, that you are held by the network, that your obligation is to hold others in return. This creates a different kind of ethics. Not rules imposed from outside, but responsibility emerging from structure itself. You maintain the bridges because your life depends on others maintaining them. You tend the network because you are part of the network. This is reciprocity as lived reality. And it may be the most important thing the canopy builders have to teach us. We have lost this. Our lives are sustained by vast, invisible networks, supply chains, infrastructure, systems so complex we barely understand them. We consume without seeing production. We benefit without recognizing cost. We exist suspended on bridges we did not build and do not maintain, and we have forgotten that we are suspended at all. This is dangerous, because invisible networks fail invisibly, and we do not understand our dependence until it is too late, until the bridges we assumed would always hold us suddenly give way. The canopy builders never made this mistake. They could not. The bridges were too visible, the dependence too obvious, the maintenance too immediate. And this visibility created culture, created ethics, created a social structure based on reciprocity and mutual maintenance because anything else was obviously suicidal. We need to make our networks visible again, to understand what holds us, to recognize our dependence and our obligation. This is not comfortable knowledge. It is much easier to assume that we are independent, that we owe nothing, that the ground beneath us is solid and requires no maintenance. But the canopy builders would look at us and shake their heads. They would see us as children, ignorant of the bridges we walk, ungrateful for the maintenance we do not perform, headed for a fall we refuse to anticipate. And they would be right. Our networks are failing. The bridges that hold modern civilization are strained, corroded, inadequately maintained. And we do not see it because we have made the networks invisible, assumed they require no attention, forgotten that existence is maintained rather than automatic. The platforms are teaching us to see again, to recognize the bridges, to understand dependence and obligation and reciprocity not as abstract moral concepts but as structural realities. Every bridge has two ends. Every connection has two nodes. And if both do not maintain their side, the bridge fails. This is simple. This is obvious. But we have forgotten it so completely that it seems like revelation when we finally understand. The canopy builders never forgot. They could not afford to. And because they remembered, they thrived for centuries in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. We can remember too, not just intellectually but structurally, by making networks visible, by creating infrastructure that requires participation, that demands maintenance, that makes dependence obvious rather than hidden. This is what the new canopy will require. Not just physical structures but social structures, economic structures, cultural structures that embody reciprocity, that make mutual dependence visible, that create ethics through architecture rather than through abstraction. We can build this. The principles are simple. Make networks visible. Create structures that require maintenance. Design systems where everyone can see their dependence and their obligation. This is not utopia. This is practical necessity. Because the invisible networks that currently hold us are failing, and we will need new networks, new bridges, new structures that we actually understand and actively maintain. The canopy builders are showing us how. Through the bridges that connected their platforms. Through the networks that required participation. Through the structures that made reciprocity obvious and necessary. We are walking on bridges whether we see them or not. The question is, will we learn to see them? Will we learn to maintain them? Will we learn to build new ones when the old ones fail? The platforms say yes, we can. We have done it before, and we can do it again. But only if we remember what the canopy builders knew. That existence is not automatic. That networks must be maintained. That we are held by bridges, and it is our obligation to hold others in return. This is the wisdom of suspension. The knowledge that comes from living between earth and sky, held by structure, aware of emptiness, conscious of the network that makes life possible. And it is waiting for us. In the platforms, in the bridges, in the principles encoded in architecture and waiting to be remembered. There is music in the canopy, or rather there was. And understanding what was lost when the platforms fell requires understanding what it sounded like to live suspended in the air. Sound is architecture. It shapes space, creates boundaries, connects distances. And in the canopy, with its acoustic properties so different from ground level, sound would have been integral to how the civilization functioned. We have evidence of instruments. Flutes carved from hollow branches, drums made from stretched hide over wooden frames, rattles filled with seeds. These are found at multiple platform sites, sometimes carefully wrapped and preserved, suggesting they were valued, important, more than casual entertainment. But the instruments tell only part of the story. The platforms themselves were instruments, large wooden structures that resonated when struck, when walked upon, when wind moved through them. Each platform would have had its own acoustic signature, its own voice that identified it across distance. And the bridges, stretched cables that would hum in wind, that would vibrate with footsteps, that would transmit sound along their length like telephone wires before electricity. Walk across a bridge and the platform at the other end would know you were coming, would feel your approach through vibration long before you arrived. This is not silence. This is a symphony of information, of communication, of ambient awareness created through sound. The canopy builders would have learned to read this acoustic environment the way we learn to read text. A particular rhythm of footsteps identifying a specific person. A pattern of drum beats conveying information across the network. The voices of platforms themselves, creaking and humming in wind, telling stories about stress and strain and structural integrity. This is language without words. Communication through sound, through rhythm, through the acoustic architecture of the network itself. And it suggests something remarkable. That the canopy civilization may have developed music not as art separate from function, but as language, as technology, as integral tool for maintaining the network. You do not need to see a bridge to know it needs repair. You can hear it. In the wrong vibrations, the dissonant harmonics, the sounds that indicate stress or damage. The network itself tells you where attention is needed, if you know how to listen. This is genius. This is integration of aesthetics and function that we can barely imagine. Trained as we are to separate art from utility, beauty from purpose. The canopy builders made no such separation. Music was information. Rhythm was technology. The beauty of sound served practical purpose, and the practical purpose created beauty. We have fragments of this. Indigenous communities still use sound in ways we are beginning to understand. Signaling across distances, communicating information, using rhythm and tone to convey what words cannot. But the full acoustic environment of the canopy network is lost. We can only imagine it, reconstruct it theoretically, wonder at what it must have been like to live immersed in that symphony of information. And in wondering, we begin to understand what silence means. When the platforms fell, when the people descended, the music stopped. Not just the instruments, but the voice of the network itself. The humming cables went silent. The resonant platforms ceased their creaking conversations. The acoustic environment that had shaped consciousness and culture for generations simply vanished. This is loss at a level we have no words for. Not just of structures or techniques, but of an entire sensory dimension. An entire way of experiencing and understanding the world. The descendants carried what they could. The instruments, the rhythms, the memory of how sound could convey meaning. But the network itself, the living acoustic architecture, could not be carried. It existed only in the structures themselves, and when those fell, it was gone. This is what we must understand about collapse. It is not just material loss. It is sensory loss, cultural loss, the disappearance of entire dimensions of experience that cannot be captured in objects or even in stories, that exist only in the living practice, in the immersive environment, in the actual structures themselves. And it cannot be fully recovered. We can rebuild platforms. We can recreate bridges. But the acoustic culture that emerged from living with them for generations, that would have been as natural to canopy dwellers as reading is to us, cannot be simply restored. It must be relearned, redeveloped, grown again from practice and immersion and time. This is the deepest loss, and the hardest to articulate, because how do you describe a sense you never had? How do you mourn music you never heard? The canopy builders knew. In their final generations, as the network failed and descent became inevitable, they knew what they were losing. And perhaps this is why some of the most carefully preserved artifacts are instruments, wrapped in bark, sealed in resin, hidden in the deepest layers of the platforms. They were preserving not just tools but possibility. The potential, however distant, that someday someone might hear the music again, might rebuild the network, might rediscover what it sounds like to live suspended in a symphony of resonant structure. We are those someones, perhaps, or we could be, as we explore elevated structures again, as we experiment with canopy platforms and suspended bridges. We have the opportunity to pay attention to acoustics, to sound, to the music that emerges from architecture itself. We can ask, what does this structure sound like? How does it vibrate? What information does it convey through sound? Can we learn to read the acoustic signatures, to understand structural integrity through listening rather than only through visual inspection? These are not fanciful questions. They are practical ones. And they open onto dimensions of architectural design we have barely explored. We build for visual appeal, for structural integrity, for function. But we rarely build for sound, for acoustic properties, for the information and beauty that emerge from how structures resonate and vibrate and sing. The canopy builders did. And in doing so, they created something we have lost and need to rediscover. Not just music as art, but music as technology, as language, as integral dimension of how civilizations function, how networks communicate, how humans understand their environment. This is the gift they are offering. Not just techniques for building bridges but understanding of what those bridges can be. Not just paths but instruments, not just structure but symphony. And somewhere in the forest, wrapped in bark and sealed in resin, the flutes are waiting. Silent for centuries but still holding the possibility of music. Will we learn to hear it again? We must speak of the fall itself. Not abstractly, not as historical process but concretely. What it meant to watch your world collapse. To know that everything you had lived in, everything your ancestors built, was ending. This is not academic. This is personal. This is the lived experience of the last generations who walked the sky before they were forced to descend. Imagine being young, 20 or 30 years old, born in the canopy, raised with the assumption that this was simply how humans lived. The platforms were eternal, the bridges would always hold, the network would continue forever. And then things begin to change, subtly at first. Bridges that always felt solid now sway differently. Platforms that stood for generations begin to show stress. The trees themselves are changing, growing differently, dying in patterns that do not make sense, failing to interlock the way they should. At first, these are isolated incidents. One bridge fails. It is rebuilt. One platform shows structural damage. It is repaired. The network has always required maintenance, and maintenance has always been sufficient. But then the incidents increase. Bridges are failing faster than they can be rebuilt. Platforms are subsiding. And most troubling, the trees, the living foundation that the entire network depends on, are changing in ways that cannot be fixed with human hands. This is when you begin to understand, not all at once, but gradually with mounting horror, that what your ancestors built cannot be maintained, that the environment itself is shifting, that the forest that has held you for generations is becoming something else, something that will not hold platforms, that will not support bridges, that will not allow humans to live in its canopy. This is existential terror. This is watching your entire world become impossible. And you have choices to make. Choices no one should have to make. Do you stay on the platforms as long as possible, hoping that somehow conditions will stabilize, that the forest will return to what it was? Do you descend now, while there is still time, while the knowledge and tools can be carried? Do you preserve what you can, or do you cling to what you have? These are the questions the late Canopy civilization faced. And we know their answer because of what they left behind. They chose to preserve, to prepare, to descend with dignity rather than fall with catastrophe. This is remarkable. This is wisdom operating under the most extreme pressure imaginable. Because the temptation must have been overwhelming to simply stay, to refuse to believe that their world was ending, to cling to the platforms until structural failure made the choice for them. But they did not do that. They faced reality. They prepared. They created the seed vessels and the tool caches and the encoded knowledge. They taught their children skills for ground-level survival. And when the time came, they descended deliberately, carrying what could be carried, leaving what could not. This is how civilizations should end. Not in denial and catastrophe, but in acceptance and preparation. And it is a template for us. A model for how we might face our own collapse when it comes. Because it is coming. The signs are everywhere, as obvious to those willing to see as the failing bridges and subsiding platforms would have been to the late Canopy civilization. Our climate is changing. Our ecosystems are shifting. The systems we depend on are showing strain that cannot be ignored much longer. And we have the same choices they had. We can deny. We can cling to current structures, hoping they will somehow continue indefinitely despite all evidence that they cannot. We can refuse to prepare, refuse to adapt, refuse to accept that our world is changing in ways that will not support our current mode of existence. Or we can do what the Canopy builders did. We can face reality. We can prepare. We can create our own seed vessels, preserving knowledge, teaching skills, encoding what will need to be remembered. We can learn to live with less, to function without the infrastructure we have assumed was permanent. We can prepare our children for descent. This is not defeatism. This is realism. This is wisdom. The Canopy builders did not end. They transformed. Their civilization descended, but their culture continued. Their children survived, carrying forward essential knowledge, adapting to new conditions, becoming the ancestors of peoples who still thrive today. We can do the same, if we have the courage to face what is happening, if we have the wisdom to prepare rather than deny, if we have the foresight to preserve what matters most. This is the lesson of the fall. Not that collapse means ending, but that collapse means transformation. And that transformation can be managed with grace and wisdom, or it can be experienced as catastrophe. The choice is ours. The Canopy builders chose grace, chose preparation, chose to descend deliberately rather than fall accidentally. And because of that choice, they survived. Their knowledge survived. Their descendants survive to this day, carrying forward fragments of what was lost, seeds of what might grow again. We are facing our own fall now, our own moment of decision, and the platforms are teaching us, across centuries, what we need to know. Face reality. Accept change. Prepare for transformation. Preserve what matters. Teach your children skills they will actually need. And when descent becomes necessary, descend with dignity. This is survival. This is wisdom. This is how cultures endure even when civilizations fall. The Canopy builders did it. And they left us the evidence, the template, the model for how we might do it too. The seed vessels are waiting. The knowledge is preserved. The example is clear. Now we must decide if we have the courage to follow it, to accept that our platforms are failing, to prepare for descent, to preserve what can be preserved, to transform with grace rather than collapse with catastrophe. This is the challenge. This is the gift. This is what the Canopy civilization is teaching us, in their silence, in their ruins, in the seeds they planted for a future they would never see. We are that future, and the seeds are germinating. What we grow from them depends on the choices we make now, on whether we face reality or deny it, on whether we prepare or simply hope. The Canopy builders chose wisdom, and they survived. Will we? There is something we have not yet addressed. Something that lingers in the myths and haunts the platforms. Something the indigenous stories hint at but never quite explain. They were not alone up there. This sounds like fantasy, like the kind of embellishment that creeps into stories over time, that turns history into legend and legend into myth. But the consistency across accounts, the specificity of details, demands that we at least consider what the stories are telling us. The Kayapo speak of those who were there before, entities that existed in the Canopy long before humans built their platforms, that watched the construction with interest, that sometimes helped and sometimes hindered. The Yanomami describes spirits of the high places, beings that belonged to the Canopy the way fish belong to rivers, that could not or would not descend to the ground. Other forest peoples tell similar stories, of encounters in the Canopy with beings that were not quite human, or not human at all, of strange lights moving through the trees at night, of sounds that were not wind or birds or known animals, of the sense, reported consistently across cultures, that the Canopy was inhabited not just by humans and familiar wildlife, but by something else. We dismiss these stories easily. Indigenous mythology, we say, personifications of natural phenomena, explanations for experiences that had no other framework for understanding. But what if we are too hasty in our dismissal? The Canopy is strange. This is something modern researchers are discovering as they finally begin to explore the rainforest ceiling in detail. It is a different world, as alien in its way as the deep ocean, inhabited by species that remain largely unknown to science. New discoveries are constant. Insects found nowhere else on Earth. Plants that grow exclusively in Canopy soil. Entire ecosystems existing 30 meters up that have no interaction with the ground below. And occasionally something stranger. Reports from researchers spending extended time in Canopy platforms describe experiences they struggle to explain. Sounds with no obvious source. Movements at the periphery of vision. The overwhelming sense of being watched. And at night, lights, not fire, not bioluminescence from known organisms, but lights that move with apparent intention, that seem to respond to presence, that vanish when approached. These are scientists reporting this. Trained observers. People with no cultural investment in indigenous mythology, who would prefer materialist explanations but cannot find them. What are we to make of this? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything strange eventually resolves into the known, and the Canopy mysteries will prove to be unusual but explicable phenomena. Or perhaps the indigenous stories are not metaphor. Perhaps they are reporting actual encounters with actual beings that inhabit the Canopy, that the forest peoples have always known about but that science has yet to classify. This is not as absurd as it sounds. We are still discovering large species in the Amazon, new primates, new felines, new birds. The forest holds secrets we have barely begun to penetrate. And the Canopy, the least explored layer, may hold the most secrets of all. The Canopy builders would have known. They lived there for centuries. They explored every branch, every tree fork, every hidden pocket of the elevated forest. If there were other inhabitants, other forms of consciousness existing in that realm, the platform dwellers would have encountered them. And the stories suggest they did. Not as rare encounters, but as regular interactions. Some accounts describe alliances, partnerships, exchanges of knowledge. Others describe conflicts, territorial disputes, the need to negotiate space with entities that predated human occupation. All of this sounds fantastic, and perhaps it is. Perhaps the beings are nothing more than misidentified wildlife, and the lights are chemical reactions or atmospheric phenomena we do not yet understand. But the platforms themselves contain evidence that cannot be easily dismissed. At several sites, archaeologists have found structures that make no sense in purely human terms. Platforms that are too small for human habitation but carefully constructed nonetheless. Bridges that lead nowhere, or that connect platforms in patterns that seem designed for beings who navigate differently than humans do. And there are the offerings. Not grave goods, not refuse, but deliberate placements of food, objects, carefully arranged materials left in specific locations. These might be ritual offerings to spirits or gods. Or they might be something else, exchanges, gifts, payments for something received. We are left with questions that cannot be answered. Not yet, perhaps not ever. But the questions themselves are valuable. They remind us that we do not know everything. That the forest, particularly the canopy, remains mysterious. That indigenous accounts deserve more respect than we usually give them. And they open up possibilities we might prefer to ignore. What if the canopy civilization was not just a human achievement? What if it was collaboration, partnership, a sharing of space with other forms of intelligence that we do not recognize because they fall outside our categories, our definitions, our comfortable assumptions about what constitutes consciousness and culture? This is uncomfortable. It challenges too much. It demands that we reconsider not just the Amazon but our entire framework for understanding intelligence, consciousness, perhaps even reality itself. But the platforms are whispering. The stories are consistent. The evidence, fragmentary though it is, points toward something we have not accounted for. The canopy builders were not alone. They shared their elevated world with something else. And that something else may still be there, watching, waiting, remembering the time when humans walked the sky and the canopy was a shared space, a meeting ground between different forms of awareness. If we rebuild, if we rise again into the canopy, we may find that it is already inhabited, that we are guests in a realm that has never truly been empty. And we will need to learn what the canopy builders knew, how to share space, how to coexist, how to recognize intelligence that does not conform to our expectations. This is speculation. This is reaching beyond what evidence strictly supports. But it is also honest engagement with what the stories tell us, with what researchers occasionally report, with the persistent mystery of the high places. The canopy holds secrets. Some we have uncovered. Others wait, patient as the forest itself, for us to develop the wisdom to understand them. And perhaps, if we listen carefully, if we pay attention to what indigenous peoples have always said, if we approach the canopy with humility rather than assumption, we will finally understand what the platform dwellers knew. That they were not alone. That the sky has its own inhabitants. And that human civilization, when it rises into the canopy, rises not into empty space but into a realm already occupied, already alive with presences we have barely begun to recognize. This is the final mystery, the one that cannot be solved with archaeology alone, the one that requires us to question our assumptions about what exists, what is possible, what waits in the green shadows between earth and sky. The platforms are silent, but the canopy itself remembers. And if we have the courage to listen, to truly listen, we might hear what it has been trying to tell us all along. In the end, we return to where we began. To you, standing at the edge of the forest, looking up into the canopy as dawn light filters through the leaves. But everything has changed now. The canopy is no longer simply wilderness. It is no longer untouched, unknowable, alien. You understand now what it holds, what it has always held. Memory, structure, possibility. The platforms are still there, beneath the green. The bridges, though fallen, left marks that persist. The knowledge, encoded in seed and story, waits for hands willing to receive it. And you, inheritor of a legacy you barely understand, stand at the threshold of a choice. The choice is the same one the canopy builders faced, again and again across thousands of years. The same choice every human faces when confronted with the gap between earth and sky. Will you climb? Not blindly, not without understanding the cost. Climbing means leaving behind the security of the ground, the comfort of the familiar, the illusion that solid earth will always hold you. Climbing means accepting suspension. Accepting that you will be held not by ground but by structure, by networks, by relationships that must be actively maintained or they will fail. Climbing means consciousness, the end of sleepwalking, the beginning of awareness that existence is not automatic but chosen, not given but maintained. This is not easy. This is why most civilizations have stayed on the ground, spreading outward rather than rising upward, choosing conquest over integration, choosing the horizontal over the vertical. But the Amazon platforms show us that another way is possible, that humans can rise, can live suspended, can build civilizations that honor the systems they inhabit rather than destroying them. And they show us more than that. They show us that such civilizations can thrive, can last for centuries, can create cultures rich in knowledge and awareness and beauty. And they show us, finally, that when such civilizations fall, they need not end. That descent is not death. That transformation can carry forward what matters. That seeds can wait centuries and still germinate. That knowledge encoded properly can survive any catastrophe. This is hope, real hope, not the false hope that everything will be fine, that we can continue as we are, but the deep hope that comes from understanding that humans are resilient, adaptable, capable of transformation. We have fallen before, we have descended before, and we have always, eventually, found ways to rise again. The Canopy civilization is not unique. It is one example of a pattern that repeats across our history, humans reaching upward, building towards sky, creating structures that seem impossible, that transcend the limitations we assume are permanent, and then falling, transforming, descending, carrying forward what can be carried, preserving what must be preserved, and eventually, when conditions allow, rising again. We are in the descent now. Our current civilization, built on unsustainable foundations, is beginning its fall. The signs are everywhere for those willing to see them. And like the Canopy builders in their final generations, we have choices to make. We can deny, can cling to failing structures, can refuse to prepare, can fall chaotically, catastrophically, losing everything that might have been preserved. Or we can descend with wisdom, can prepare, can preserve, can teach our children the skills they will need, can create our own seed vessels, our own time capsules, our own messages to the future that will come after the fall. The Canopy builders chose wisdom, and because of that choice, they survived. Their knowledge survived. Their descendants survive, carrying forward fragments that are now being remembered, reconstructed, restored. We can make the same choice. We can prepare for transformation rather than desperately trying to prevent it. We can let go of what cannot be saved and hold tight to what must be preserved. And we can do something more, something the Canopy builders in their time could not do. We can learn from their example, can study what worked and what failed, can understand the principles that allowed a civilization to thrive for centuries in one of Earth's most challenging environments, can apply those principles to our own situation, our own challenges, our own attempts to live sustainably within complex systems. This is not about copying the platforms. The world has changed. The challenges are different. What worked in the Amazon Canopy 1,000 years ago will not work in exactly the same form today. But the principles remain valid. The insights remain true. The wisdom remains accessible. Build upward. Integrate with systems rather than replacing them. Cultivate consciousness. Maintain networks. Accept interdependence. Prepare for change. Preserve knowledge. Teach children through participation. Face reality with courage rather than denial. These are not historical curiosities. They are living principles, and they are needed now more than ever. The platforms are teaching us. The seeds are germinating. The stories are being told again. And we, standing at the edge of our own forest, looking up toward our own canopy, have the opportunity to learn, to remember, to rise, not to recreate what was. That is impossible. The Amazon Canopy civilization is gone, and it cannot be restored. But to create what might be, to build our own version, to rise in our own way with our own materials for our own time, to become the skywalkers of a new age. This is possible. This is the gift the platforms offer. Not a blueprint, but a permission. Not instructions, but inspiration. Not rules, but principles that can be adapted, applied, transformed for new conditions. We can rise. We can build elevated structures that honor ecosystems. We can create networks that distribute rather than centralize. We can cultivate consciousness as carefully as we cultivate gardens. We can learn to see patterns that are invisible from ground level. We can accept our dependence and maintain our networks. We can live suspended, aware, awake. And when we fall, as we eventually will, because all structures are temporary, we can descend with grace, can preserve what matters, can leave seed vessels for those who come after, can trust that the cycle will continue, that what falls will rise again, that humanity will remember and rebuild and reach for sky again and again, as we always have, as we always will. This is who we are. This is what we do. We are climbers, builders, dreamers who look at impossibility and see invitation. The canopy builders understood this, and they left us evidence, scattered through the forest, encoded in seed and soil and story. The evidence says, you can do this. You have done it before. You will do it again. Rise, build, suspend yourself between earth and sky. Live consciously in relationship, aware of the networks that hold you. And when the time comes to descend, descend with wisdom. Preserve what matters. Plant seeds. Leave messages. Trust that someone will find them. That someone will understand. That someone will climb again. We are those someones now. Standing at the edge. Looking up. Deciding. And the canopy waits. Patient as it has always been. Ready to hold us if we have the courage to climb. Ready to teach us if we have the wisdom to listen. Ready to transform us if we are willing to rise. The platforms are calling. Across centuries. Across collapse and preservation and rediscovery. They are calling us home. Not to the ground, but to the sky. To the space between earth and heavens where humans learned, once, to live suspended. Where we might learn again. If we choose it. If we climb. The answer is in the canopy. It has always been there. Waiting. And the first step is simply this. Look up. See what is possible. And decide. Will you rise?